The
The
violation
garden must
notice
be
was
removed
still
by
taped to her
sunrise or daily
mailbox
fines
when
begin.
the HOA president announced to the entire block
This is
that the garden had
non-compliant.
to be removed
These
by
plants are weeds
sunrise
invading
or
our space.
fines would
They
begin
must be
stacking
removed.
daily. And the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was spectacle, because everyone knew the garden had been there for 3 years and no one had complained until now. But tonight the clipboard was out. The cameras on phones were raised and the word non-compliant echoed across the cul-de-sac like a verdict already decided. And Denise Carter stood at the edge of her own front yard, gripping a pair of gardening gloves in one hand, as if they were the only thing tethering her to calm, while the HOA president, Eleanor Whitmore, I adjusted her blazer and gestured sharply toward the rows of native plants swaying softly in the evening breeze, as though they were weeds invading a sacred space instead of carefully curated life. And Denise could feel the weight of every watching eye pressing into her back, neighbors pretending neutrality while leaning just close enough to catch every word, and Eleanor's voice carried the crisp confidence of someone who believed authority alone made her correct, as she declared that the garden violated aesthetic uniformity standards and disrupted property values and posed environmental uncertainty. Phrases so rehearsed, they sounded less like concern and more like ammunition. And Denise inhaled slowly, because she had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only fed narratives already forming in other people's minds. And she asked calmly which specific clause her pollinator garden violated, her tone measured even as humiliation crept up her spine. But Eleanor's smile tightened at the edges, and she replied that the board had discretion to determine visual harmony and that the mixture of wild grasses and flowering shrubs did not align with community expectations, and a murmur rippled through the crowd because the garden was beautiful, butterflies hovering in lavender arcs, bright cone flowers lifting toward the fading sun. But beauty suddenly seemed negotiable under the glare of a clipboard. And Denise felt the familiar sting of being evaluated not just for her landscaping, but for her presence, her choices, her refusal to shrink, and when Eleanor added that several concerned residents felt uncomfortable with the overgrowth, now the word uncomfortable hung in the air heavier than soil after rain, and Denise's jaw tightened, though her voice remained steady as she explained
The
that
board has
every
determined
plant
this
in the
mixture of
yard
wild
was
grasses and
native,
shrubs does not align with
drought-resistant,
community expectations.
beneficial
Every
to the
plant in
local
this yard is
ecosystem.
native.
But Eleanor cut her off with a raised palm, reminding her that the HOA had final say and that compliance was not optional. And someone in the crowd shifted, another cleared their throat, but no one stepped forward yet, and the pressure mounted as Eleanor announced that if the plants were not removed by morning, contractors would be hired to clear the yard at Denise's expense. And that was when Denise felt the humiliation tip into something sharper, because this was no longer about flowers, it was about control. Oh, about being told that something she cultivated with knowledge and care was disorder simply because it did not mirror trimmed hedges and imported turf. And she looked around at her neighbors, searching for a flicker of recognition, for someone to acknowledge the unfairness rising like heat from pavement, but most avoided her gaze, unwilling to challenge the authority standing so rigidly at the curb, and Eleanor seemed emboldened by their silence as she made a show of writing on her clipboard, her pen scratching loudly enough to punctuate the threat. And then a car door closed down the street, the sound small but decisive, and heads turned as a woman stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a leather satchel and wearing the calm expression of someone who understood exactly what she was walking into. And Denise's shoulders lowered a fraction because she recognized her immediately. Dr. Alana Brooks, the regional environmental biologist who had consulted on city conservation initiatives and who just happened to live 2 streets over. And Eleanor's posture stiffened, though she tried to maintain composure as Dr. Brooks approached, her gaze sweeping across the garden not with suspicion, but with professional curiosity. And when she spoke, her voice was clear and measured, asking which specific environmental code the garden
What proof
violated,
is there of such designation?
because as
Denise
a certified
registered it 2 years ago as a
biologist,
pollinator
she was
habitat,
familiar
but
with
aesthetics are
both
still under a
municipal
jurisdiction.
guidelines and state conservation incentives. And the shift was subtle but immediate, because authority had entered the scene in a form Eleanor had not anticipated, and Denise watched as Eleanor's confidence flickered, just briefly, And before she insisted that this was an HOA, matter not a scientific debate, but Dr. Brooks nodded thoughtfully and explained that the garden qualified under the state's Native Habitat Protection Program, that removing it without cause could actually place the HOA in violation of environmental preservation statutes. And the crowd reacted with a low collective intake of breath because the narrative was no longer simple, and Eleanor's pen paused mid-air as she asked what proof there was of such designation, and Dr. Brooks calmly opened her satchel retrieving documents stamped and signed, explaining that Denise had registered the garden 2 years prior as a certified pollinator habitat, complete with species list, soil reports, and municipal acknowledgement. And Denise hadn't mentioned it earlier because she believed education would be enough. But now the paperwork spoke louder than restraint ever could, and neighbors leaned closer, phones lowering slightly as the dynamic shifted, and Eleanor's lips parted as she scanned the documents, her earlier certainty dissolving into visible calculation. And when she attempted to argue that aesthetics still fell under HOA jurisdiction, Dr. Brooks gently reminded her that federal and state protections superseded community preferences, especially when environmental impact was involved, and the word superseded seemed to land with more force than any raised voice, and Denise felt something steady settle inside her chest, not triumph, but relief, because this was never about winning, it was about being seen accurately, and a neighbor finally spoke up asking why the board hadn't reviewed these facts before issuing threats. And another admitted they actually admired the garden's color and the butterflies it attracted. And the murmurs grew bolder, no longer directed at Denise, but at the process that had nearly erased her work overnight. And Eleanor's shoulders tightened as she declared that the board would revisit the matter, her tone thinner now, stripped of its earlier authority. And Denise met her gaze, calmly asking if the violation notice would be retracted publicly as it had been issued. And that request lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. And after a long pause, Eleanor nodded stiffly, stating that the notice would be withdrawn pending review. But the crowd already understood what had happened, that a decision made from assumption had collided with knowledge and lost, and as neighbors dispersed slowly, some offering quiet apologies, that Denise knelt beside her lavender, brushing her fingers across the petals, grounding herself in the simple truth that what she planted had value, whether recognized immediately or not. And Dr. Brooks rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder before walking away. And the evening light softened across the once contested yard. And in that quiet, Denise realized the garden had done more than attract butterflies. It had exposed how quickly difference is mistaken for disorder and how fragile borrowed authority becomes when challenged by facts. And as the sun dipped lower, casting gold across every leaf, she understood that sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't loud at all. It simply grows patiently until the world is forced to look closer. Subscribe for more chilling true crime stories.